Hello, and welcome to a new episode of NSPE's Committee Corner. I'm your host, Margaret Edwards, and this week we're here to talk about interstate license mobility, and we're joined by NSPE Vice President Bill Atkinson. Bill, thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
Great, you're welcome. So before we, turn things over to our conversation with Bill, let's first kind of look at the conversation that's happening up on Capitol Hill around interstate license mobility. And Congress is looking at this through the lens of military spouse licensing reciprocity, particularly at the Military Spouse Licensing Relief Act of 2021. It's a bicameral piece of legislation, so it's been introduced in both the House and in the Senate. And this bill would allow a service member or a military spouse who has a professional license in good standing in one jurisdiction, and then they're relocated because of military orders. The professional license or certification of the individual shall be considered valid at a similar scope of practice and in the discipline applied for in the jurisdiction of the new residency and throughout the duration of the military orders and the time that they're living in this new place. To receive recognition of their license, the individual must provide a copy of the military orders, that require them to relocate. They must remain in good standing with the initial licensing authority, and they must submit to the authority of the new licensing authority in the new jurisdiction in which they're living, for purposes of standards of practice, discipline, and fulfillment of any continuing education requirements. This is different from other proposals that we've seen across the country, mainly because one, it's a federal piece of legislation. It's not something that the states are looking at themselves. Takes, it's not state specific, it's, much more broader. Just a little bit quick status update on the bill. HR 2650, the House version of this legislation, was introduced by Congressman Mike Garcia from California. And this bill was added as an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2022. And then the Senate version was introduced by Senator Mike Lee of Utah. And for the Senate, we're going to keep an eye on this bill, particularly as the full Senate takes up consideration of the National Defense Authorization Act. So we'll keep an eye on it. Maybe it will get added as an amendment to the Senate's work on this bill, and then we'll pay attention to what happens as it keeps moving through the legislative process, particularly if it goes to a conference committee. And taking a step back and bringing this a little bit more to NSPE. NSPE has been looking at, license mobility for military spouses for some time now, at least, since I joined the team here at NSPE almost 3 years ago. This was mentioned and included as a key legislative priority in both 2020 and 2021 in one of our key issues for the professional engineer documents that we have in our advocacy tools. And we've kind of seen this as a window to the larger conversation around universal licensing and interstate license mobility. It would also be, a missed opportunity if I did not mention that the Alliance for Responsible Professional Licensing, or ARPL, which NSPE is a founding member of, has curated a report titled License to Move, which explores several examples of how states can responsibly accomplish flexibility and mobility for professional licenses. So with that all being said, let's turn to having a conversation with 2021, 2022 NSPE Vice President Bill Atkinson. Bill, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks.
So my first question for you, kind of to set the stage a little bit, in looking at licensing and the structure that we do have in the U.S. So what are some things that you discovered particularly in your time serving on the Vermont licensing board that worked well or could be fixed to be better within our current licensing system?
Sure. So, in regards to the state licensing board, one of the more difficult conversations was always around reciprocity or comity. It has several different terms that it's thrown around as mobility. It's always for the licensing boards. It's one of the harder issues to wrap around because it's not typically a single and easy checkbox. For instance, in Vermont, as with a lot of states, we have language that says that we'll license anyone that is licensed in another jurisdiction that's substantially equivalent to ours. As you start looking back to people that have been licensed 30 years, for instance, that may have not taken the PE exam or may not have an ABET accredited degree, it takes a little bit of extra digging on the licensure board to determine whether they meet the minimum standards or not. So definitely reciprocity, mobility is certainly one of those issues. It's not one that there's an easy answer to. So when you ask about what can be done to fix it, there are a lot of different ways that states have approached that.
Yeah. And of course, yeah, definitely, a lot of different ways. And kind of, sticking a little bit more to the professional engineer's license. Most states, do have some process for distributing reciprocal license, which you kind of hinted at just now. So, are there any ways that our existing system can be improved to, maybe make that easier or, make it smoother than what exists now?
Sure. So there are a couple of systems out there that states have come up with. One of the broader statements is for the states to start looking at what their requirements, where their requirements are similar as opposed to where they're different. So for instance, the NCES model law is one example of a standard that some individuals use to make mobility easier. The Arizona, as you and I were discussing earlier, Arizona's universal licensing recognition law is one way that they've attempted to make it easier to solve a particular problem they had, which was, needing more licensed professional engineers within the state. Several states, they've done a state compact model or proposed in many cases. Those are ways to increase mobility, increase the ease with which engineers can move into your state and start practicing sooner. In some cases, they do decrease the ability for the state to maintain their own minimum standards, or they could. Those are a couple things that states have already, how they've tried to address mobility.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, kind of leads well into the next question I want to ask. You brought up, Arizona's universal licensing recognition approach, as well as state compacts. So what kind of, benefits, if any, that can, either of those structures kind of, structures or approaches bring? And are there any, negative factors that aren't usually considered when implementing, a system for universal licensing recognition or state compacts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on some of the benefits already, but and especially with COVID, where a majority of people at some point have probably worked remotely over the last couple of years, it does make the geographical boundaries seem less of an impediment, right? So I think you are going to see not just engineers, but other technologically minded individuals able to cover a broader geographical area. So certainly that's one way that mobility could help, or figuring out how to more easily recognize license across jurisdictions. As far as the drawbacks, most of or how states are working to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Arizona is a good example. They have kept language in there that make sure that you haven't been disciplined in other states or under investigation, that you're not moving states to avoid penalties, that kind of thing. So I think the laws do need to be carefully crafted, as they all do, but there certainly are paths there that can be gone down.
Yeah, and I know one thing, kind of, since I mentioned the ARPA report earlier, as I was kind of introducing the issue, that I think within license to move, within the report itself, kind of it touches on, professions, much like, professional engineers already having, some system in place, and kind of issues some warning almost to, to not make it like more, hurdles for folks to kind of have to go through in order to get a reciprocal license, or to have their license recognized in the state, which is, something that I think also is something that's necessary to keep in mind. I think, we've been talking about the Arizona bill. The one thing that's, I think, not often mentioned is that the Arizona bill has a residency requirement. So that's one extra step that folks have to take in order to actually receive recognition of their license from their initial state. Yeah. So.
No, I mean, that certainly is one piece of it. They were trying to solve a particular problem, right? So one way to approach it.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of, jumping off of, our conversation, kind of just about, license, mobility, reciprocity, comedy, whichever term we want to use for today. And kind of knowing that NSPE has been, following this issue, why is it important that NSPE should have a seat at the table around this conversation?
Sure. I mean, at NSPE, we have a broad reach and knowledge across engineering disciplines and states with regards to the licensing laws. NSPE is the one organization that can represent all professional engineers as they navigate through their journey to protect public health, safety, and welfare. Through our state partners and contacts with the licensing boards, we can certainly help them understand how it might affect them, or we'd love to hear some of their discussion points about any concerns they have. As you said earlier, I mean, this is one of the first ones that I know about that's made it this far in terms of a federal law for reciprocity of engineering licensure. So definitely, I think NSPE can bring together a really broad-ranging engineering community. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we can bring to the table.
Yeah, I totally agree. And kind of to wrap up our conversation, and kind of we talked about the why NSP should have a seat at the table in this conversation, and so I think kind of transitioning to more to a how. I think one way NSPE can have an effect on public policy is by having PEs in elected or appointed positions, and appointed on licensing boards, like you served on a licensing board. So what is something that you would say to your fellow PEs about how serving the public in this capacity is so valuable?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, being appointed to a board is it can certainly be an honor, but one of the things that engineers can bring to the table, especially in more public committees, and some of that is often they bring logic into the room in a broader capacity than perhaps other individuals. Engineers are really good at breaking down problems, looking at all sides, benefits, drawbacks, and not being afraid to discuss both of those, regardless of where their opinions lie, right? And as professional engineers, we also bring a high degree of ethics into the room, which helps us see through, some of the more pointed opinions and some of that. So I think that's really it. I mean, as engineers and professional engineers, anytime we can and feel passionate about public policy, we can really help round out discussions and bring in things that help people make decisions. So
yeah, I think that's fantastic. And so that was the last question I had for you, Bill. So, thank you so much for joining us today, for having this conversation, and kind of, helping us, add a little bit more to, what we talk about in the committee corner beyond, legislation that's happening and the conversations happening up on Capitol Hill. So thank you.
yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. It's really important stuff.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks.
So with that concludes this episode of Committee Corner. Please be sure to tune in next time for our final episode of 2021. And since it's our final episode of 2021, we want to hear from you, our audience. If there are any questions that you want to ask us, we have two ways of doing that. The first is we have a campaign within the NSPE Advocacy Center, which is one of the places where you can find the Committee Corner. And you can submit questions there, or you can even send them to governmentrelations@nspe.org. And maybe your question will show up in our next episode. Again, you can find the Committee Corner in the NSPE Advocacy Center or on the NSPE YouTube page. Thank you.
Thanks.